On July 14, 2025, a statement from the U.S. Department of Commerce sent shockwaves through the entire North American agricultural market. The Trump administration unexpectedly terminated the 2019 tomato suspension agreement and slapped a 17.09% tariff on all fresh tomato imports from Mexico. What left businesses and consumers in utter shock wasn't just the tariff itself, but the way it was implemented. No transition period, no prior warning. Truckloads of tomatoes already en route across the border were immediately taxed. It was a move that bore Trump's unmistakable signature, decisive, unilateral, and driven by the slogan, "Protect American farmers," above any traditional trade agreement. But the price Americans had to pay, many didn't see it coming. Behind the rhetoric of defending agriculture lay a clear political calculation. The Trump administration aimed to bolster its protectionist image and score points with key farm states ahead of the election. At the same time, the move sent a strong warning that the U.S. was ready to punish any trade partner it deemed unfair. But this politically charged policy immediately collided with the reality of supply chains and with the grocery carts of everyday Americans. Each year, the U.S. imports nearly $3 billion worth of tomatoes from Mexico, around 1.8 million tons, making up 70% to 90% of all fresh tomatoes consumed nationwide. Once the tariffs kicked in, retail prices surged 10% to 11% within just the first few weeks, and could climb to 18% to 20% during the off-season. The result? Border consumers and businesses were the first to suffer, while domestic farmers couldn't immediately reap the benefits. Drought, labor shortages, and short growing seasons meant U.S. production couldn't ramp up overnight. A single politically driven decision turned one of the most common produce items into the epicenter of a price crisis, setting off a domino effect with long-term consequences for the U.S. economy and trade. For years, farmers in Florida and California, the two states that account for around 90% of U.S. fresh tomato production, have faced intense competition from Mexico. Mexican tomatoes are 15% to 20% cheaper, thanks to labor costs of just $2 to $3 per hour in a year-round growing season that allows for a steady, uninterrupted supply to the North American market. In contrast, U.S. farmers deal with $14 to $16 per hour labor costs, frequent droughts, and strict environmental regulations, making domestic production significantly more expensive. Trade groups like the Florida Tomato Exchange have repeatedly warned that without protective measures, American farmers would lose their competitive edge in their own backyard. In that context, Trump's tariffs emerged as a swift and decisive response, not only aimed at easing domestic pressure, but also at reinforcing a political message that he would protect American farmers at all costs. Within just the first few weeks, nationwide tomato prices rose an average of 10% to 11%, and experts warned they could climb as high as 20% during the off-season when domestic supply typically drops. The price spikes were particularly stark across different tomato varieties. Beefsteak tomatoes jumped from $2.99 per kilogram to $3.30, $3.50 per kilogram. Roma tomatoes rose from under $1 per kilogram to $1.50, $2 per kilogram. Organic and specialty tomatoes saw the sharpest increases, 30% to 40%, quickly turning into a luxury item for many families. For importing businesses, the shock was even more severe. Nature Sweet, a major supplier to the H-E-B grocery chain, reported losses of over $1 million per week, due to both the tariff burden and delivery disruptions. The surge in prices wasn't driven by tariffs alone. It was also fueled by defensive pricing behavior from distributors who feared supply chain breakdowns and growing instability in import flows. The surge in tomato prices didn't just show up on receipts, it quietly worked its way into everyday meals and livelihoods across America. In Midwestern schools, the familiar lunchroom salad began to disappear. To cut costs, schools were forced to replace fresh tomatoes with cabbage, mashed potatoes, or frozen vegetables. As a result, school meals lost their bright colors and became noticeably lower in nutrition, a change even young children could easily notice. In restaurants and fast food chains, the shift was subtle but unmistakable. Fresh salsa and pico de gallo, key ingredients that defined flavor, were swapped out for canned sauces or prepackaged alternatives. Observant diners immediately sensed the drop in freshness and quality, even as prices continued to climb 10% to 11% in the first few weeks and potentially up to 18% to 20% during the off-season. In households across the country, especially among low-income families, the price shock hit the hardest. Fresh tomatoes were cut from grocery lists, replaced by canned beans, pasta, and cheaper, less nutritious foods. This wasn't just a change in taste. It was a direct hit to family nutrition and health, especially for growing children. The impact spilled over into border towns where local economies depend heavily on agricultural imports from Mexico. Cold storage facilities, loading docks, truck drivers, and distribution workers in Texas and Florida faced reduced hours or layoffs as import volumes plunged. Estimates suggest that as many as 46,000 jobs and $8.3 billion in revenue across border communities are at risk if the tariff remains in place. In other words, Trump's tariffs didn't just target Mexico, they struck directly at the wallets of American consumers, altered eating habits, hurt nutrition, and pushed tens of thousands of border workers into economic uncertainty. In response to the 17.09% U.S. tariff, Mexico took an unusual strategy. There were no heated press conferences, no threats of retaliation, and no attempt to turn the situation into a media war. Instead of engaging in a head-on confrontation, Mexico chose silence and a strategic pivot, quietly working to preserve revenue and stabilize its export markets. The path Mexico chose was clear: redirect trade flows to Canada, where it saw a safer, more sustainable market. As soon as Trump's 17.09% tariff took effect, Canada's largest retail chains, Loblaws, Metro, and Sobeys, moved quickly to sign long-term import contracts with Mexican exporters, extending through 2030. These agreements secured a stable tomato supply for Canada, a country that consumes around 800,000 tons of tomatoes annually, with 60% to 70% of that total dependent on imports. Previously, much of that supply passed through the U.S. as a central transit hub, but Trump's tariffs forced a shift in the trade route. Data shows that in 2024, Canada imported $310 million worth of Mexican tomatoes. After the U.S. imposed tariffs, that trade flow surged, and experts now predict it could reach $2.8 billion by 2026, almost matching the size of the U.S. market that Mexico just lost. Remarkably, these contracts span 5 to 7 years, a rarity in the fresh produce industry, signaling that Mexico places far greater trust in Canada than in the U.S. As a result, Canadian retail chains have become more than just buyers. They've become strategic partners, helping Mexico stabilize revenue and dramatically reduce its dependence on the U.S. market. Alongside locking in supply through long-term contracts, Canada has made major investments in logistics infrastructure to transform itself into a strategic gateway for Mexican agricultural products in North America. New cold storage facilities and distribution centers in Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia can now handle and preserve over 50,000 tons of fresh produce, cutting long-haul spoilage rates by 15% to 20%. Bilingual English-French packaging lines allow products to be ready for direct export to Europe, opening up new markets beyond domestic consumption. If Mexico's shift toward exporting to Canada continues, the U.S. could face a double loss, not just in the tomato industry, but also in its strategic role in North American trade. In the past, the U.S. served as the central transit hub for agricultural goods in the region. Produce from Mexico typically passed through the U.S. before being redistributed to Canada or exported to other markets. Cold storage facilities, inland ports, logistics firms, and distribution centers across the U.S. benefited enormously from this role, generating tens of thousands of jobs and billions of dollars annually in ancillary revenue. But now Canada is steadily taking over that position. Distribution hubs in Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia are replacing the U.S. as the main transit points for Mexican produce.